Sera was not invisible because she was small. She was invisible because people had practiced not seeing her for so long that it had become their talent. Every morning she walked through the village market with her herb basket on her arm, and every morning the crowd moved around her the same way it moved around the old broken cart at the edge of the square. Not deliberately, not cruelly, just automatically, the way people avoid things they have decided are not worth the effort of thought. She was 19 years old. She had not spoken a single word in 7 years. Not because she could not, because the day she turned 12, Elder Voss had stood before the entire pack at her wolf presentation ceremony and declared her wolf cursed, broken, an embarrassment to the bloodline. He had said it with the calm certainty of a man who had never once been wrong in public and intended to keep that record. The pack had believed him. Her mother had lowered her eyes. Sera had stood there in the ceremonial circle, with the mark burning on her left shoulder, and the elder's words settling over her like ash, and something inside her had made a very quiet decision. If they wanted silence, she would give them silence so complete, it would become its own answer. 7 years later, she was still giving it. The boys who flicked pebbles at her back had grown into young men who still flicked pebbles at her back. The women who whispered about her mother's shame had found younger daughters to whisper to, so the story had spread in the way bad stories always spread, wider with each telling, thinner on truth. Elder Voss still walked the market square with his hands behind his back and his chin lifted, the posture of a man guarding an empire no one else could see. Sera carried her baskets. She listened, she watched, she waited, though she could not have told anyone what she was waiting for. Then the announcement came. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories was conducting his inspection tour. Every pack under his rule would receive a visit. The pack would be evaluated, ranked, and rewarded or corrected according to what he found. The village collapsed into excited preparation. New tunics were sewn, floors were scrubbed. The eligible daughters of every ranked family were drilled on how to stand, how to speak, how to smile just enough to be remembered. The Omega girls were gathered quietly and told, in voices that left no room for argument, that they would stay in the background. They would serve, if needed. They would not present themselves. They would not draw attention. Sera was assigned to the kitchen. She nodded and went. The morning the king's convoy arrived, she was at the healer's stall at the far edge of the square, delivering a bundle of dried herbs, when the horses came through the main road. She pressed herself against the wall of the stall the same way she pressed herself against every wall, without thinking, without drama, just the long-practiced habit of taking up as little space as possible. She saw him, Alpha King Kale. He sat his horse with the kind of stillness that comes from absolute certainty about who you are and where you belong in the world. He was not performing authority. He simply had it, the way some people have height, or the way mountains have presence, not earned in the moment, just there, massive and unremarkable to itself. Sera's wolf, which had been quiet and watchful for 7 years, went absolutely still inside her. Then it screamed, not in fear, in recognition. She dropped one bundle of sage. It hit the ground and she stared at it and thought, with the flat clarity of someone receiving terrible news from a part of themselves they cannot argue with, I am not going to survive this week. The king's head turned, just slightly. His eyes swept the edge of the crowd with the practiced scan of a man who sees everything and shows nothing. He saw her. For 1 second, half a second, less than that, he saw her. Then Elder Voss was at his stirrup, talking, and Sera picked up her sage and walked back to the kitchen. She served dinner that night. She moved between the long tables with the particular invisibility of someone the room had collectively agreed did not need to be acknowledged. She refilled cups. She set down bread. She kept her eyes on the floor the way she had learned kept people comfortable. She set the bread in front of the king. His hand moved, not grabbing, not reaching, just stopping. His fingers rested lightly against her wrist for less than a second, the way you might stop someone from walking into traffic. The way you might say, without words, without making anything of it, I see you. Her whole history pressed itself against the inside of her chest. She walked back to the kitchen and put her hands flat on the cold stone table and stayed there until they stopped shaking. Behind her, through the doorway, She could hear Elder Voss toasting the king's health in the voice he saved for powerful men. She could hear laughter. She could hear the comfortable noise of a pack showing its best face. She stood at the cold stone table and breathed. At midnight, she went to the temple. She had been going for years, always at midnight, always alone, always stopping at the gate because the gate was as far as she had ever allowed herself. But that night, the gate stood open. Not broken open, not forced, just open, the way a door opens when the person it belongs to finally arrives. And she stood on the threshold for a long time. Then she walked through. The murals covered every wall from the stone floor to the high ceiling, ancient and detailed, painted in colors that had survived longer than anyone currently living. She lifted her lamp and walked slowly along the first wall. The history of the Alpha bloodline, the founding of the Northern Territories, the sacred covenant between the king and his chosen. She stopped at the third panel. The figure at the center was depicted in profile, a young woman, standing alone, painted with her left shoulder turned to show the mark she carried, a pattern of lines that Sera had worn on her own skin since the night Elder Voss had called it a curse. The same mark, exactly the same. The inscription beneath it was old, but she could read it. She had always been a careful reader. It said, "The Silent One carries the bond. The bond will not be broken. The bond will not be rushed. When the temple opens, the covenant begins." She sat down on the stone floor. She thought about 7 years of pebbles and whispers, and her mother's lowered eyes. She thought about the market and the kitchen, and every wall she had pressed herself against. She thought about the word cursed, and how long she had carried it, and how heavy it had been, and how it had never once felt like the truth, just like something someone had decided, and she had been too young and too alone to argue with. She thought, oh. Just that one word, quietly, to herself in the empty temple. Oh. Then she heard boots on the stone path outside. She turned. He was standing in the doorway. The Alpha King, without his guards, without his convoy, without the careful performance of official visits. Just a man in the dark holding a lamp, looking at her the way the mural looked at her, like she was the point of everything, and everything else had always been the margin. He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. 4 words, the first she had spoken in 7 years. She chose them carefully, the way you choose something that has been saved for a long time. "You already know," she said. His expression shifted, something in it loosened, the way a held breath loosens. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has been carrying his own piece of this knowledge, and is relieved to finally be in the same room with someone who shares it. He said, "I found the records 2 years ago. I have been searching since." She looked at him for a long time. 2 years, she said. "I know," he said. He did not make excuses. She respected that. She turned back to the mural. He came and stood beside her, and they looked at it together in the lamplight, this ancient painting of a girl with a mark on her shoulder standing alone, and neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was the first silence in her life that had felt like rest rather than punishment. At dawn, he called the full gathering. Every elder, every ranked alpha, every member of the pack from the highest house to the lowest. They assembled in the square with the confused obedience of people who have been summoned by power they cannot refuse, and are not yet sure what it wants from them. Sera stood at the back. She had been standing at the back of rooms her whole life. She stood there now without thinking. He found her anyway. He spoke first about the prophecy. He spoke about the sacred covenant, and the temple murals, and the mark of the chosen, and the bloodline records that had been stored in the royal archive for 600 years. He spoke with the unhurried calm of a man who is not asking for agreement, only informing people of how things are. Then he walked toward her. The crowd parted. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the old scar along his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes that came from a man who had never been uncertain about anything and had now made peace with the one exception. He went down on one knee, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, on one knee on the stone square, in front of the girl the pack had kept out of every room that mattered for 7 years. Elder Voss made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when the story he has been telling about himself for 40 years suddenly stops being true. Cale looked only at her. "I should have come sooner," he said. It was not an apology exactly. It was heavier than an apology. It was a man telling the truth about a debt he already knew he could never fully pay, and choosing to say it out loud anyway, in front of everyone. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought of her mother. She thought of the morning she had dropped the sage. She thought of 7 years of cold stone tables and empty gates, and the weight of a word that had never been hers to carry. She reached down and touched his face, brief and exact, the first deliberate touch she had offered anyone in all that time. Her fingers against his jaw, just for a moment, the kind of touch that says, "I see what you are. I am not afraid of it." Then she stepped back and offered him her hand to rise. He took it. Behind them, the square was completely silent, the particular silence of people who have been wrong in public and are now absorbing the full size of it. Elder Voss did not speak. The butcher's son looked at the ground. The women who had whispered stood very still. Sera walked out of that square beside the king, with the dust of 7 years still on her hands, and the mark on her shoulder, and 4 words of spoken language in the past week to her name, and she did not look back once. She did not need to. The silence behind her was finally, properly, earned by the people who had created it.